All right, so we're back. Sorry about that. My memory ran full, so we're going to go ahead and continue. As I was saying on the filters, those are your first step to starting an aquaponics. You have to have a biological filter of some sort, depending on what you're growing. So again, if you have a lettuce plant and you were to plug in a bunch of lettuces on a raft system, now a raft system is where you take some sort of flotation device, such as styrofoam, is generally used. And if you guys give me one quick second, I'll go ahead and go grab some, and we'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so this is a noodle. I got it for 50 cents, probably a dollar at the dollar store. So this can be used in a lot of systems. I have built so many systems from this thing. I had two originally. And as you can tell, I have about 3/4 left of one. So in terms of our raft system, it's basically just saying that you have an elevated surface that floats on the actual water surface. So you could take a bunch of these and run them on a piece of board all across to where it floats. Have a bunch of holes in it to where you can just build plugs for plants, and boom, you are now using an aquaponic system called a raft system. So it's a raft. It just sits there, kind of floats. It goes up and down with the water level. I've also built cloners off of this. So there's a million different types of cloners. I was experimenting for things like fruiting bushes and stuff. I have a hard time cloning those in dirt, so specifically. So I threw some shrimp, some ghost shrimp, and some guppies. I think it was about 2 guppies, and I tried to make sure they were females so they didn't breed. Because during cloning, you have to be very careful of the nutrients provided. Too much nutrients is not a good thing. They don't need really any nutrients at all. I was just doing it because having those fish in there, even though, yes, it's not a sterile environment, it is technically more sterile. Well, actually, that's a bad reference. Um, since it is in a sterile environment, it allows beneficial, good bacterium, positive working forces to outwork the negative forces. I was also increasing oxygen. So I had a 20 to 60 gallon aquarium air pump pushing on a little bitty the shoebox, the plastic Tupperware shoe boxes. You get them for like $1. So I had it running on, same as here, the little 6-inch air stones, the strips, and I let them go. I would cut. I drilled 8 holes in it, and I had cut little sections. I can show that to y'all in another video. I forgot to grab it. And I basically would wad them up. So I would split one in like right here, and then I would have another piece just kind of shoved in there. So that way, let's see if we can demonstrate. The plant would sit in there firmly. You can see it's nice and snug, but it's not going to snap it. So that way, the stems could dangle. So if the foam and the lids were right here and the plant was up here, this section of it, just bare plant stem, can be exposed to high amounts of air and water, which is specifically what they need. Uh, Too much is a bad thing. Again, we were experimenting with different water levels. I found that it did better if I filled up the tub all the way as far as I could without causing issues, and then just letting it slowly drain down about halfway. When you're pushing that much air into something like a cloner, you have to worry about evaporation. Evaporation is going to happen, and it was under that LED light y'all are familiar with. Um, they did well, but I ended up finding better results off of things like wicking pots. And again, we can totally get into that in another video. I just kind of want to mostly stick with the base aquaponics for now. So anywho, you can create a million different versions of a raft. I've also used this in a Kraki system. So a Kraki system is where you take a bucket and you drill holes in a lid. or just basically you find something to hold water, and you find something to sustain plants at a very specific level. You don't introduce any fish. You don't introduce any sort of air. You don't introduce anything. It's literally just water in a bucket, and the roots grow into it. Um, it's a very base hydroponic method that can be used with other things. Um, for example, in an aquaponics, we would use the next step up from a Kraki, as I would consider it, which is a deep water culture. That's basically a Kraki, but it sustains a very specific amount of like a water line. You don't really let it fluctuate too much, and then you also have a lot of air. Taking something like that, you can tie that into almost any liquefied system. Hence, vermicomposting, aquaponics, hydroponics, and some a system like that could also be changed out for a wicking system. A wicking system is where you have a media, and just so you guys know, media means material. It literally means growing material. It doesn't mean it provides nutrients. It doesn't mean it doesn't provide nutrients. It doesn't mean it absorbs water. It doesn't mean that it's just a rock. All of that is a media. Coconut fibers, rock wool, expanded lava rock, normal lava rock, expanded clay, um, peat moss. I mean, you name it. If the roots are going to grow into it, it is generally referred to as a media. So when someone asks you, well, what media are you planning on using? That means what do you want it to physically grow in? Even if it's a little pod, um, like you would use in a deep water culture, which is basically kind of like a net with your media of choice. A lot of people use, I think it's like an expanded rock wool or something. It's like this tan fiber, and I actually have some in here from when I bought the plants uh, from the pet shop originally. Anywho, that's what media is. They're trying to ask you what you're growing in, because it all has a different purpose. Hence, like a wicking bed, you're probably not going to hook it up to a deep water culture. You would probably do it to a shallow water reservoir that has a float valve on it. You know what I mean? So it's just going to be a little bit different, but the same concept. The big thing is figuring out what you do best with. If you're someone that does amazing in container gardening, try out some wicking beds. They're nice, they're easy. Um, you can set them up for pretty much pennies on the dollar, and you can build most of those systems yourself. I don't do as well with container gardening, so I tend to stick with things like raft systems. I do pretty well with deep water cultures, and actually planting outdoors. Like I said, I have a harder time inside. It doesn't mean I can't. It's just I don't like to struggle with it. I don't like to have to care that much. I don't want to be checking my plants all the time. I want them to be a little bit more self-sustainable since we are on a homestead. Um, so like that's pretty much what you'll be looking at. You can actually have in an aquaponics a container like this that pumps into another reservoir and then drains back or pumps back into here. Um, it's all about tying in. There's no specific science that you have to follow outside of the basic where are the nutrients coming from, how much are you producing a nitrogen, or are you producing more of like a pk, where your trace mineral is going to come from, how long is the plant growing, things like that. This is a pretty standard system, and again, all my systems run on something like this. Um, every single tank we have actually has the sponge filters on them, and we were thinking about getting ducks. Even their pond would most likely run on a sponge filter, and it's just because of how useful, how universal they are. The ability to have a slow feeding system that can be ran purely off your air pump and still increase the oxygen in the water is just insanely handy. Again, there are downfalls, but sometimes I wouldn't mind adding an extra air pump, whilst I probably would mind if I had to add a water pump because of the electrical load. We do a lot of water displacement here. What that means is so in something like this, say I have another 5 gallon bucket sitting next to it. What that I would have maybe like a deep water culture or some sort of raft bed. A raft bed is where you just have like a shallow 6 to 12 inch bed that can be elevated at any surface, and the water just kind of flows through it, creates a nice current. The roots love it, and it's just a raft, nothing special. But it helps separate it from the fish because some fish will eat your plant roots, and that's just something you're gonna have to live with. I mean, it happened. I mean, that's how they live. Fish generally live by eating other fish, bottom feeders, or plant vegetation. I mean, that's what would they naturally eat. So that's where the raft beds are useful. But anywho, if I was to do something like that, I would probably take my raft beds and create a siphon. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with water bridges. A water bridge is where someone will take a clear tubing, glass, anything, and essentially waterlock it. So they fill this thing with water and then they flip it upside down to where it creates a bridge, and both ends are capped, and then they set them in the two water sources. So one side would go in this tank and one side would go in another tank or whatever. That creates a siphon. And whenever that creates a siphon, that means if the water level in here goes down and the water lock is maintained, the water level in the other container will also go down until the water lock is no longer maintained. So they actually regulate each other in terms of water level. So if you follow something like that, the water will naturally displace itself. And then you can run into a bed. Say you run an air pump into a bed. So the beds that you have 3 raft systems or whatever. The water bridge carries it over, and your water siphon comes all the way around until it has like a deadlock point over here. We'll say it's an empty bucket to just kind of keep water going, and that's where your pump is. So you take your water pump or your filter. You can be placed before it or after it. There's a million different ways. Again, uh, but you basically have one spot where you're pushing water, and all the others will naturally fill and regulate themselves. So you have this constant flowing system, and then you can get crazy with it. You can take something like this, where the fish tank is, and put a float valve on it. Attach it to the city water and have a water dechlorinator filter. You can get them cheap. RV filters work. That's what we use for all of our water around here. We don't use the water dechlorinator anymore, and there's a couple reasons. I'll swing back around to that here in a second. But anywho, and it would automatically regulate the water level. So that means your water would constantly be going around, and it would always stay at the same rate. Because every time you're turning that water and sending it over here, and all that movement is going to cause a lot of oxygen. That's a good thing. The downfall is when you oxygenate water to a certain point, it starts to evaporate, and so you're going to have to replace that. That's why I was saying the water displacement works, but the water bridges, once they hit a certain level, essentially once air is allowed into that water lock, it will drain, or something to that effect. It will stop. It will cease to exist. So if you have that happen in a system like this, and you haven't checked it for a while, or you didn't set it up appropriately, you will have your water continue. It will continue pumping, uh, but it will create an issue. That is why I like these guys. So if you follow that water lock, that water displacement theory, that means you can just keep a couple inches below, if you can spare it, of course, um, just for safety reasons. And that means that if this continues to pump after a certain point, remember, because of the level, and if you haven't seen part 1, go ahead and take this time, go back and see part 1. But basically, how high, I was telling you guys how high the piping is how high you can actually push the water, and the force and momentum, all that stuff. So once it stops working, it's going to stop pumping water. So this will go up and it'll regulate all the way around, and it'll just be bubbling. There is a downfall to that, and the downfall is your fish and your plants will not be receiving enough water, but you can recover from that. Now, if your water pump is in there and it's pushing, if you run a system like this, you need to have safeties, something, because otherwise that water pump will continue to run and it will ruin your pump over time, if not almost immediately. Water pumps are kind of delicate, and that's why I like to run with these oxygen guys, because I always have backup air pumps. Um, they're cheaper and they're easier to access than a water pump. I'm sure at some point I will have to use a water pump, but for as long as I can use these, I'm going to, just because they're safer. If the electricity goes out, I don't have to worry about it. I can have a little solar panel or something that can at least power my systems if the electricity was to go out. We do have water heaters in some of our tanks, and that is another thing y'all will need to know later on if you do decide to start messing with aquaponics, vermoponics, any of that. Water temperature is important. Um, for this tank, we actually have a water heater in the back over here, and we have another tank. We had some crawfish and some other fish in. We were attempting a natural environment. So those of you that know, guppies breed like crazy. It's unless they have a predator, they will stay unchecked. And even with the predator, they can probably still outbreed the predator, for sure. They're just insane. They just spit babies all the time. And we actually have breeder tanks that we use for feeder guppies. But we were feeding because the crawfish that we received were actually from a lake, or not a lake. They were from a tank. The tank had been drained, and a buddy of mine brought them over so we could like save them. It was kind of like a save the environment sort of scenario. Um, they're just pets now. I don't plan on eating them. We're not going to be growing them out. We may try to breed them later on, but we're not going to put any of these crawfish at risk, since they are wild, and we're just trying to help like rehabilitate them. Uh, we were using that system to see how they would do because they needed more live fish to eat originally, and it did work. It worked wonderfully, but that means that we had to kind of regulate the temperature. So that's where that water heater is very important. Um, the rest of our tanks, we don't use water heaters. Even our breeder tank, we don't use water heater because it's inside. I do have a water heater for the outside tanks, but those are not hooked up to the garden right now. I'm not 100% set in the system that I'm building, so that's going to be done at a later date. But always watch the water temperature, especially with your plants. That's why we have them in this tank as well, because of the plants. Plants do better between 60 and 80 degrees. That's when they do their best. Fish like it between that as well. Generally, after 80, they're going to start to die, and generally lower than 60, they're going to either start to die or complain a whole lot, pretty much stop eating. Um, the temperature determines how much they can ingest, so to speak. So when it's hotter, they need more oxygen. They're going to need more water changes, and they're going to eat a lot more. They need more water changes to deal with the water, the load on the water, with their poop and the urea. Um, when it's colder, you're going to last a lot longer before you have to do a water change because they're not really going to eat. You're going to have probably overfeeding issues there for a little while. And that's where you see like little strands coming out of their anal cavity just kind of floating. That means you've been overfeeding them. You need to back off on that, and kind of let their body clear and rid itself of any blockage. Um, so water temperature, if you're getting into an aquaponics or anything, is going to be very important. Um, on our aquaponics that we did, and I've also done like a vermoponics, uh, I find that the nitrogen is there, but in terms of micronutrients and pK, I'm not very impressed. For me, it's not worth it. Yes, it does save on water. All of these sort of systems are going to save you. You're going to use like 10 to 20% of the water you would use in a garden, especially us that grows in sand. So that's why we've been experimenting with it. Um, and in terms of plants, we've also the reason we use the filter is because whenever you use a dechlorinator, the chemicals in it are actually really hazardous to your health. You don't want to ingest those. Now, on vegetables and stuff, I don't know if it would matter as much on maybe a tree, but things such as bushes and lettuces, tomatoes, broccolis, things that are going to absorb all of that, we found it was best to just use a filter, and cheaper actually, because I spent $25 at Walmart for two RV drinking water dechlorinators, which remove chlorine and chloramine. Y'all need to know that. Chlorine actually bubbles out. You can generally bubble it out within 24 to 48 hours, which means you put an aquarium bubbler into a bucket of just water, and that chlorine will bubble out. Most cities, and check with your local water supply facility, they use chloramine. Chloramine is generally used because it lasts a lot longer. That can be bubbled for over 2 weeks without it being removed. So we went ahead and we opted. Our area does use that, so we opted to use a filter. Um, and that's just how we keep this whole cycle cleaner. And to me, the fish do better, the plants do better. Like I said, these are mock systems. Eventually, we will be growing our food off of it, but again, just not heavy feeders, because I can produce um, a cheaper and much more reliant fertilizer that's not going to be missing random nutrients, and place that into our soil. I can naturally work with it. If you are going to be doing heavy feeders, there are things you can do. We did an experiment with what is called a dual root zone. And I know this is a lot, guys, so please bear with me. Take breaks. This it's a lot of information, but we did a dual root zone. So what that is that's actually where you have, y'all remember the deep water culture and wicking beds. It's a mixture. So basically, you have a root zone up here, which would generally be better under a hydroponic setting, not necessarily a living soil, super soil like I have, but we are experimenting with trying to do something like that. Anywho, it's basically where, uh, and you can look up the octopots. The octopots are a really good example. It's where the roots can tap into a natural water source. So they go through the soil, and the soil level stops right here, and then it's just this water reservoir. It's not necessarily touching; it's just here and has like a little bitty slow bubbler, on the side. So the roots go through and they tap that water source. Those are the tap roots. So it's kind of like a drinking straw for the plant. You can have as much water as you want, but we want to be able to control your nutrients. So you can run an aquaponics like that through for nitrogen. But whenever it starts fruiting, you're going to need to replace that with standard water and do a PK dominant, so basically a flowering fertilizer or a fruiting fertilizer on the top of the root zone. And generally, you're going to want to use something organic that's not going to complicate your system to where you can't reverse it back to the aquaponics for the nitrogen. And I know, see, that's kind of a pain, and that's the reason we haven't set that up yet. I do have an area I want to try it. So I have a porch area that's going to be shaded. I don't want to have to get a water cooler. See, that's the other thing. That's the other reason. It gets so hot in our area. We're in Texas, so it gets so hot in our area that the water heats up as it goes through, and it ends up basically burning your plants unless you do an indoor setting. Um, Indoor just isn't feasible for us. We're trying to get that electric bill down, not kick it up. So something like that, I would typically just do maybe during like a spring or a fall, but that's not a very productive system. I mean, that's only 6 months out of the year split up at best. So again, that's why we're going to be working on some different systems. All of that in mind, that's where you can get crazy with it, and that's another experiment we're going to be working on. So theoretically, I make all of my, so actually I do make all of my nutrients, and I always start it with some sort of aquaponic base, because you have to have a water for the teas that I bubble, and before I distribute them to the plants. So generally I use aquaponics. It's a free nitrogen, and it has other stuff um, that you just can't be replaced. The plants have such vigor. Like, there's just something in the water outside of the nitrogen that really helps them. Um, Again, outside of deficiency, always regulate it in that. But then I add, I'll use a composted manure or really dried out manure, and I use pantyhose and maybe like some just sort of bar in a 5 gallon bucket, and I'll run different mixes in the different pantyhose at different times. So generally, fungal you're gonna want to do for shorter periods of time, if not longer periods of time. I mean, I would experiment depending on the soil you're working with. We have sand, so I try to do what is more of like a short, just quick brew, not actual teas. There is a name for it. I just don't remember it right now. Um, but you take something like that, and I'll also take some of our soil, maybe some oatmeal to kind of help with the funguses and stuff from the soil as like an inoculant, and I bubble it. I let it go. Sometimes if the garden is really struggling and like I don't want to just spend hours on end spraying plants with a garden. I use a garden, the Miracle Grow garden sprayer. It does a 1 to 25 ratio, so it gets it right every time, kind of thing. But anyway, I bubble those for generally about 4 to 24 hours. And if it's just lacking, I may add a dash of Miracle Grow. That's why we call this hippie organics. Uh, I try not to use chemical fertilizer, but because we have such a pure, basic dirt, it's not really a soil, even though we've been amending it for years. Um, sometimes it's just a little easier and a little cheaper to just dash in a little extra for the micronutrients or anything that I may be lacking in that department. Generally, the plants respond pretty well without the Miracle Grow. I use that maybe once a month just to kind of make sure it's rounded, and I use an all-purpose fertilizer, so it has uh, identical amounts. It's kind of like an 11, 11, 11, but I use the Miracle Grow all-purpose, for vegetables and stuff. Um, and that's pretty much it, guys. That's a really good starting point. Um, the inspiration behind this video was I have a friend that I'm trying to help. He's learning about tanks. He's really starting to get into it, and I was just like, well, why don't we go ahead and stop, do a video, and just put the information out there so you guys can do this too at home for a really good price. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, questions, concerns, just anything. Even if you disagree with me, let me know. Let's talk it out and learn together. You guys have a good one, and we'll see you on the next video that I have to do today.